have some questions that I'd like to put to you, if I could. And they're really going to focus on the theme that when we looked at your works and we thought, well, what would be the theme of this event for the Sydney Writers' Festival? We thought they were all transformational histories. And so I want to sort of probe into that a little bit. So I think it's fair to say that writing histories that transform the way a topic, a place, or a people is understood is what we all aim for as historians, such that our research and insights make a difference and that they move the state of the field forward in a way that is perhaps more evidence-based or fairer or more allows for more comprehensive understandings than we've had in the past. However, the idea that history changes is unsettling to many non-historians. And we've all heard the phrase rewriting history being used in a pejorative sense, particularly, again, another wave of it in recent months, particularly, again, with regard to the Black Lives Matter movement and the actions to remove controversial statues. So, did you set out to write a transformational history? And if so, why? What did you see as lacking in current interpretations of your topic? And so, Meredith, I thought we might start with you. Taking the Bible as your starting point might suggest a Sunday school type of history might follow. But with your dramatic opening lines about a surfer emerging from Botany Bay with my brother's keeper tattooed across his body, we sort of know from the beginning this is going to be.
No.
So could you tell us more about that? Did you set out to write a transformational history?
Well, I love the idea that it is transformational. I'm trying to make sense of this for myself because in a way, as I hinted before, it's a very personal book. In a way, it was about what kind of transformations have occurred in my own lifetime and what might still occur. So, I mean, I grew up near a national park that's absolutely dense with documented Indigenous sites near Deerubin, the Hawkesbury River, and without ever having really given much thought to that, even though middens, carvings, grooves were ordinary everyday parts of my environment that we would notice but not think about. And then at the same time, I grew up as a Sunday school kid, very heavy doses, you might say, of the Bible right through my childhood and in my family life. And yet finding very few spaces where the conversation about what does it mean to be descended from colonizers in a land that wasn't ceded, and what does it mean to have a complicated and contested Christian baggage, which I think it's true for me, but I think it's true for settler Australia, colonized by the British at the high point of the Enlightenment. Where is the conversation about how those things can be considered in the same frame? And if you take a religious history approach, at least in the older versions, it was more ecclesiastical or biographical great men of the church. It was kind of its own niche area. And then we had really, I think, formative books for me like Hilary Carey's Cultural History of Religion in Australia, John Gascoigne's work on the European Enlightenment and the origins of European Australia. Those kinds of books showed me, and I mean, even to an extent, Manning Clark, reading him, showed me that there were ways of trying to bring those big questions into the same frame. And yet we also have this discourse in Australia that this is a secular nation. Religion's never really been that dynamic except for a few sectarian bun fights that, thankfully are over now, more or less. We have this idea, and even that you might quarantine the religious question to 1 week of your overview course on 19th century Australia, rather than as a part of someone's lived experience like race or gender or class that might actually filter through all kinds of experiences and layers of seeing the world. And so I think I was trying to find a way through, and in a way by treating the Bible as a cultural object, and not just as an object, but as a cultural cluster of things that we use this term Bible for, it actually allowed me to bring all that onto the same page, because it's not a history of the church. It's not a history of believers or even of Christian social movements, but of everybody, as far as I could make it that way, including Louisa Lawson, Alison. Some of your characters crop up in my book too. And what I found was that sometimes Australian history is quite a secular discipline, but what I stood on the shoulders of everybody else to write the book. I went and reread the things I'd read before, from the primary sources up to the secondary literature, and realised that actually there's a lot, if you look for it, that people have already found and thought about in relation to those big questions here in Australia. And so in a way, it was what I think I learned was that Australian history has been told in mainly secular ways, but that it's everywhere. Like the religious history aspects have been noticed by historians of class, certainly historians of the frontier and of kind of the contact between different groups in the colonial period especially. The whole discourse around missions history and the way those sources have been used. There's actually heaps in there if you go looking. And so I wanted to bring that onto one page. And then when we get to questions of nation, work by John Hurst and Alan Atkinson, I mean, his history of the Europeans in Australia had a huge, huge impact on me and I think bringing all that together was an experiment to see if I could tell the story in this way. Whether it's transformational, I mean, I think it's changed me as a person and what I think religious history can be, which is something that's not separate from the ways we talk about our common life, but something that's messy and integrated and part of that, whatever our beliefs might be. And yeah, I think it's going to take me a few years, I think, to see what changes, if anything changes, whether there's an uptake, whether students read it. I think it'll be a long time to see what the actual transformation might become.
Yeah. Would anybody else like to come in on that? I have more questions in my bag of tricks if you don't, but I just wondered if anybody's sort of urgently wanting to say what they saw as lacking in current interpretations that they thought their project might address.
I'll say one small thing, which is really that I'm not really a historian. I'm not really a historian properly, but one thing that was interesting to me is the question of writing complex stories for a general reader. So really trying to take stories that are known to specialists, stories that I'm familiar with because I've been paying attention to fields of anthropology, for example, in the Pacific for a long time, and take that information and just really present it in a way that I've had a lot of people who've written to me and said, I don't know anything about this subject. And especially in America, it's really, people just don't, especially on the East Coast, they just don't know anything about it. So the idea of being able to take the information and present it in a way that makes it like a good read for people so you're sort of teaching as much as anything else. That feels like an important thing to do, even if the story you're telling is not a story you've made up. It's not a new story particularly, but it's to reach a different audience.
Can I jump in here, Nancy?
Yes, of course, Alison, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of back up what Christina said and say that, I didn't really intend what I was writing to be transformational either. I felt more that I couldn't have written this book 10 years ago, and I was taking the work of a whole lot of other historians, including the massacre map, Lyndall's massacre map. I made use of that and drawing all of that and trove those sorts of resources and Indigenous sources as well. And I couldn't have done that 10 years ago. And I really feel like this isn't so much my original research as just a compilation of a whole lot of other people's into a story. Yeah.
Perhaps I could add something there about the changes in technology have been much more transformational than I as a historian, than I realised. The fact that so many sources now are simply available just by being here at my desk, and realising that these sources can now be made available to the whole community. And that really is quite mind-boggling for a conventionally trained historian like me, to realise that many of the sources that I use can now be looked at by so many people. That's quite transformational. I think it raises a whole range, it'll enable people to ask completely new questions about the sources that are out there. And there's no doubt that 19th century newspapers, for example, are the backbone of 19th century Australian history. I mean, that's where most of the information is, and it's very widespread. Wonderful newspapers, and many more in, every country town in Australia had at least one, if not two, newspapers. It's hard for us to understand that today, where we see as only the metropolitan press and a few regional papers as the dominant discourse. And they're, of course, all rapidly disappearing. So I think that this technological change has opened up the 19th century in a way that I had never understood before. And although I would call myself a historian of colonial Australia, I had never for a moment thought that I would be able to read all of the newspapers, so many of them, and get a broad sense of them. And I think that's very exciting. Very exciting.
I think it is. I remember Henry Reynolds was one of the first to really delve into the newspapers from this perspective, wasn't it?
Yes.
But I think he remembers going to newspaper offices in small towns and looking at crumbling copies of the papers before they were even microfilmed.
Yes, yes. And we do, and not all of the newspapers by any means got to Trove. Some of them were just too crumbly, but it does indicate a much livelier rural Australia than we imagine today.
Yes.
I mean, part of what I was interested in is what kind of transformations are we living through?
Yes.
And the question of, technology is a huge one, but the knock-on implications for something like how do we read and what do we read? One of my favourite stories that I came across was of Robert Menzies' grandmother. So around the turn of the century, had 4 books: the Bible, the Presbyterian hymn book, a book of legends, something else like that. That she just read over and over and over again, 4 trusted texts that she read intensively. And then with the rise of for many other people, it was already by that time reading extensively. What does that mean for a sacred text? The ways we read have changed enormously as we've become voracious readers of all kinds of things that we read only once. So what does that mean for something like devotional reading? Are we seeing a massive drop-off in the way people engage with the Bible, or is it actually holding up as a focus of intensive reading much better than any other book? And so to actually problematize what kinds of transformations are we seeing? Is this about the decline of a Christian nation? Well, my short answer, no. Well, here's a spoiler: no. There was never a Christian nation, and decline is too simple a category. It's about transformation, and to actually try and track how is this changing, and how from how we read to what we believe, to how we talk to each other about those things, is what I was really interested in trying to probe. And I think for me, part of writing about religion, since the book came out, we've got a Pentecostal Prime Minister, we have Trump and his photo ops during the Black Lives Matter protests, the Bible as this kind of weaponized totem in support of a kind of a white racialism. For me, there's a very fast-moving, transforming context around even what the word Bible might trigger for people, whether that's profound harm or something sacred, and trying to, how do you have a long conversation about the reception of something as complicated as what some people consider to be the word of God, when the politics actually is throwing up categories and images that obstruct a slower but perhaps deeper conversation. And so for me, in a way, my work is about trying to resist the categories that our media cycle imposes on the subject, because the transformations that are interesting and I think probably culturally significant don't fit into those media categories. I mean, and Lyndall, I suspect this is part of what your work is resisting with the binaries that got thrown around with black armband, white blindfold. that actually trying to find ways to draw attention to serious things that, you know, can't be reduced to a slogan is part of what is needed.
Good point.
So just changing gears a little bit, this session was supposed to be part of a writers' festival, so it would be remiss of me not to ask a question about writing. And I thought I might direct this in the first instance to you, Christina. Much of your work, your book, is about the meeting of minds between oral and literate cultures in the Pacific. And I wondered to what extent was your writing shaped by your insights into how dramatic storytelling, situational thinking, and concrete detail characterize history keeping in oral cultures?
That's an interesting question.
Indeed.
I don't know whether I could apply it directly that way to my own sort of practice, but I certainly was interested in the idea that there was this kind of storytelling. You know, one of the things that some people have said to me is, why did you start with Captain Cook? Which I didn't start with Captain Cook, actually, but, you know, the explorers come early in the book. It's like, why didn't you start with the oral traditions? Which is, if you go back to like Michener's Hawaii, you know, he starts with the kind of epic formation of the islands and then the mythic, you know, and everything. And the thing for me is that once I started looking into the source material for the oral traditions, which was absolutely the gnarliest and most interesting and most difficult part of the book, partly because it hasn't been worked on as much, I found that those stories, that the complex of the oral traditions, the kind of knowledge that's been passed down about everything, about history, about islands, about geography, about everything, is such complicated material. You know, it's oral, so it's changing over time. It's documented at a moment in time by a set of people with a particular agenda and particular biases. That becomes your canonical text. It's full of mistakes. It then gets, you know, reinterpreted in the modern era, missing a lot of the 19th century context in which it was recorded. So people start to take it as a kind of dogma, you know, as a kind of doctrinal truth, which it probably never had in that way. So I think it's like really complicated material. So I felt that unless you looked at it in the context of when it was documented and how that all worked, but I feel like there's much more, I had much more to say about that stuff than I had room for in the book. That was definitely a place where I didn't get to do as much as I wanted. I had an editor who kept saying to me, "You're in the weeds."
We like the weeds sometimes.
Wonderful.
You gotta get out. So it's like, okay, I gotta move on. But, you know, that's partly, you know, writing for, again, kind of commercial, you know, writing a book for a trade house, for a big, trying to reach a big audience. You gotta stay away from the weeds.
And so, Alison, you would be conscious of weeds as well, I guess. And so often historians, you know, we write something twice as long as it should be, and then we have to cut it out, and we say, well, I just can't cut anymore. It won't make sense if I. But you are down to, you know, I don't know how many words a page, 50 or something. Yeah. So how do you cope with that?
It's a tremendous amount of jiggling. The book is actually. A lot of it is written at the same time as the pictures are being done, and so you write a bit and you send it across to the editor and she has a look at it, and we try and fit the pictures in, and then we go, no, there's too many words. So it's, and sometimes you just have to drop things, you know. So stuff went that I would have liked to have kept, you know, a great quote. I
call that putting it in the bank, and maybe you'll be able to get it out later.
Yeah, that's right. And then there's times when I was talking to a woman up in remote Western Australia about Jan Damara, and I needed to get her people's, her elders' approval, really, for including the story and their view on the way I'd written it. And she said to me, "Alison, it's not good enough. I haven't even shown it to them because it's not good enough," which was, you know, like, okay. And she was right. It was too short, and it just didn't give enough of the different angles. And because we felt that was a really important thing to include, we made more space by chopping something else. So the white guys went in favour of the black guy. Okay.
Wow.
Now, we do have some questions from people in the audience, and so I might just pose one of them. This is from Kathy Perkins. She asks, these are all major works of history that we're talking about today. Have you found it hard to decide on your next project? How do these, is it the first album? It's not the first production for most of you, but the one that gets a lot of attention, goes to the top 10. Does it make it hard to think about the next project?
Perhaps I can go as the oldest here. This was supposed to be the project that would complete my academic career.
Oh, come on.
But I do have a contract to write the book of the map and to unfold all the questions that have arisen from the map and that people have written to me about. And so I'm juggling with that at the moment.
Great. Anyone else? Have you moved on to the next project? I mean, Meredith, yours appeared in 2018, you said, so it's been a while since you finished writing, I guess.
Yeah. It's, actually, NewSouth are putting out a new edition just in time for Christmas.
Wonderful. Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm actually still in shock I wrote this book basically as an unemployed academic in a fragile gig economy with 2 young kids emerging from my second bout of maternity leave, trying to process some things for myself. And I had, I guess, a structural privilege that allowed me to just write for a couple of days a week. We could afford to take the pay cut. And so I'm still reeling, actually, from the ride. And working out what it means for the reception of the book. What does that reveal about our capacity to imagine certain pasts and certain futures? That it's posed questions for me that I haven't resolved. And the second edition, actually, I have to write. I'm meant to be writing it now.
I should be writing.
Aren't we all? I've got to write that down to include in the second edition. So that's the next thing I'm writing, which is, I don't know, words don't flow during a pandemic very well, but that's the current.
They don't, no.
But I think I've got lots of questions. I think, have we really looked at kind of the theological discourses of race as they were taken up by different communities in Australia around the time of Federation? Like, what did the churches actually think about white Australia? I'd love to see a PhD on that. I don't think there is one, but there are big, how can that not have been, let alone people outside the churches as they deployed theological language. I think there are some really big points where some deep drills would be great. Yeah. I think the history of Indigenous theology, I mean, I'm delighted to see how much more work is being produced, especially by Indigenous theologians and scholars on those kinds of topics. But I mean, I think Australian history is such a wonderful field because so much of it
has yet to be written.
But reinterpreted and rethought with new questions. Yeah. I'm not saying I'm going to write any of that. I ended up in broadcasting. I write a radio script every week now. That's killing me. But I think there's a big field if you're prepared to take the question of religious experience seriously. There's lots, environmentally, all kinds of things.
Yep.
Yeah. And Christina, are you working on a current project?
I'm thinking at the moment. As I said, I'm very slow. One of the things that happened to me that was kind of surprising to me was that when I wrote my first book, I was also very slow, and it was a story that had both I thought of it as a history, but actually it had all this personal stuff in it. It sort of had a memoir thread. So it was kind of braided, And then when I got done with it, I thought, okay, I have figured this out. I know how to do this. You take this one thread and then you take this other thread and you do this thing where you go back and forth. So when I started this one, I thought, okay, I'm going to do that again because I figured out how to do that. And I started it and it just totally failed. It just didn't work at all. It was just, I had this chapter where I was talking about, this kind of epic history of Polynesian migrations and like my rental car in the Marquesas. I was like, you know what? I'm getting cognitive dissonance here. This is not going to work. So I abandoned it and, invented a whole new kind of approach. And I'm afraid I am deeply afraid that I'm going to have to do that again. You know, that I'm going to have to my next subject will require that I invent yet another way to write. So it'll take again forever, which is sad because I'm getting on, and you know, I don't have that many years. You know, so I don't know, but I'm thinking. Yeah, thinking.
What about you, Alison?
Well, I've written 2 non-fiction histories in a row, and after I'd done that, I was just like, I'm just dying to write some fiction. So to be really honest, I'm writing a novel set in ancient Egypt.
Wow.
Yeah,
wow.
which is wonderful escapism during, lockdown.
Just what you need.
Yeah, that's right. It's really good.
Yeah.
And I have talked with Penguin about writing a sequel, about writing the 20th century, and I really honestly have not found a good way to do it. Yeah, I haven't found that narrative arc that you need, and I haven't. My editor and I have discussed sometimes how looking at history has this. When I write about ancient China, I can include all these details, these really gory details for children about beheadings and executions and capital punishment and stuff, and nobody blinked. I have never had any negative feedback. But we feel that the closer you get to the modern day, somehow the more sensitive people become to those kinds of details, and the less able you are to poke fun at people's kind of sacred memories of their history. And so yeah, I don't know that I could write the same kind of light-hearted, slightly horrible histories approach to 20th century Australia.
I was struck by one of the descriptions, a description of a bungled execution, hanging that you described.
Oh, yes, in South Australia.
Gory detail.
Yes. Yes.
It's okay for kids, but it's a bit much for the adults, really. Now, we're just coming to the end of our hour together, so I wonder if I could put that last question that I foreshadowed to you, which was, what has it meant that you've won a Premier's History Award? What has that meant for you and your writing and the piece of work that was awarded?
I just want to say for me that it was huge. It was just huge. It was fantastic. It made me so happy. I was in America, but I felt connected to Australia. I felt appreciated by Australia. I felt tied to Australia in a way that it sometimes doesn't feel that because I'm in Boston. It's too far away. And I don't sound like an Australian. But a lot of my life was there, and a lot of my thinking is there, and a lot of my training was there, and a lot of my intellectual framework is there. So it was fantastic, and I want to thank you, everybody who was involved, because that was super great.
Yes. Okay. Thank you to the judges. You know who you are. Okay. And Alison?
Yeah, likewise, I was so chuffed. I can actually say award-winning author. That was really, really great. And it means I'm thousands of dollars richer. And basically, that money just goes straight into the research for whatever comes next. Yeah. It's just
thanks for mentioning that, because I think that is significant. And Meredith was talking about precarity and so on. And Lyndall, what did the award mean?
It was incredibly affirming, because we were, certainly the research team was very wary about what the reception to the map would be. It obviously it was in the aftermath of the history wars, and we were kind of prepared for all the negative responses, which largely didn't come. So getting the digital history award was it was a huge fillip to keep going. And it's been and we've all felt that. I think I speak on behalf not only of the entire research team, but also for Lorena Allam and her work as well. We felt that we were touching the right, the project was touching the right note, I suppose, and enabling us to continue on. It's been very, very positive indeed.
Yeah, thank you. And Meredith, did you have anything to
all of the above? It's been really huge in terms of finding a voice from that position of precarity. The lost wages of writing, I think the prize money absolutely helps. It's not a solution to the structural issues, I think, in the production of history, which I think we need to keep thinking about. But I think too, I was just encouraged that a topic that can be so polarized and that is so difficult to talk about faith in corporate areas in common life, that history actually offers a way of speaking with one another. It can be divisive, we can fight over it, but we can also slow down and think well together I think history as a discipline has so much to offer our civic life, and that even on a topic like religion, as polarized as it is, that I was just encouraged that maybe what we see in the punching bag of the media isn't everything, and that another kind of conversation is possible. And so it actually filled me with heaps of hope that when it comes to the climate crisis or resolving the structural inequalities we still live with, that maybe historians can have something to share as well as something to learn.
Yeah, definitely second that. That's great. Well, thank you so much to each of you. I've really enjoyed hearing your perspective on your works, having read them, and just marvelous. This time has just flown for me. So thanks for enriching our understandings of the past and for the fresh historical insights for wider audiences. And we do look forward to the next installments. So thank you also to our audience and to the staff of the History Council, Catherine Shirley and Cassandra Roger, who do so much behind the scenes to make these events a great success. The theme for History Week this year is History, What is it good for?
Wow.
History, what is it good for? So until the next event, thank you so much for attending. Thank you to our speakers, and goodbye for now.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, everyone.